So this is journal article 2, and this is on the American Ways, which probably was my favorite reading of this week. And it talks about communicative style and how that changes across cultures and how sometimes Americans seem odd or rude to other cultures based on our actions. And they're things that I've never really thought about because I'm American. I've lived in America my whole life, and I've only been out of the country twice. And one of those times I was 3 years old. So I never really noticed that it was odd the way that I guess I act compared to other people. So some of the things that it says we differ on is the topics we prefer to discuss, favorite form of interaction and conversation, depth of which we want to get involved, communicative channels, level of meaning to which they are most attuned as far as what you're most interested in. And the first thing that it talks about is Americans engage in small talk. We primarily tend to talk about weather, jobs, anything that just seems like general knowledge and doesn't seem anything too personal. And he was saying how Americans, we don't really talk about politics, or we don't really debate, which I noticed is true because I tend to walk away from conversations, or I tend to avoid people who I'm like, I don't get along with you, or I don't believe the same thing you do, and I'll go out of my way to avoid those people. And it just was talking about how that's normal for Americans. I'm not odd in that sense. It's just Americans don't like debating. We don't like arguing. And the next thing it talks about is how in America our conversations go back and forth very quickly. One person doesn't talk for too long, and I thought that was interesting too because, like, just observing my conversations today, I did realize that you say 2 or 3 sentences and then it's the next person's turn, and I've never really talked to anyone from a different country for a long period of time, nor have I picked up on that. But I realize when I talk to individuals who take too long to talk, I get annoyed easily. And Americans engage in far less ritual interactions, and that's kind of the how are you, I'm good. And the third form of interactions, and we talked about this earlier, is Americans tend to avoid argument or debating. We don't like that. And the fourth and final form of interaction is self-disclosure. And so it's talking about how Americans don't like to give a lot of information on their personal lives, that if you can't really look it up, we don't really want to tell you. Is kind of how it goes. So, like, for social media, a lot of people will talk about their jobs and their kids. Anything that you could see on their Facebook page is pretty much what they're willing to talk about. Past that, we don't really talk about how much you make or our political views or pretty much anything we want to post on a general social media page. We don't really talk about in person. And it's talking too about how men don't disclose too much about themselves to anyone in general, and thinking about that too. I'm a lot closer to my mom than I am my dad because my dad's not super talkative or doesn't really tell me a lot about his, I don't want to say personal life because I'm his family, I kind of am his personal life, but his job or what's going on or how he's feeling, he doesn't really talk about that, but I'll talk about that with my mom for hours. And part of that is also just we're the same gender. And it also is talking about how Americans don't have a ton of friends, which I think is interesting because I always joke that I only have 3 friends. One's my mom, one's my brother's fiance, and one is my boyfriend. And those are kind of my friends and people that I rely on and that I know if I got in a car crash, they would be there. But past that, I don't really know. I mean, my dad and my brother would obviously be there too, but those are people that I can talk to for hours and never get bored of them, or we could go and eat dinner, we could do anything. It's not just we do this one thing and we're done. We're not going outside of that. It's not a school friend that I meet once a week at school to study, but I wouldn't necessarily take that person to go work out with me. And the next thing it talks about is we depend on spoken words more than nonverbal behavior. I don't really know that I notice this too much in America. I feel like I relate a lot on nonverbal behavior, but that just might be because the people that I use that behavior with know what those nonverbal cues mean. And then it goes on and it talks about how furniture arrangement can also be a nonverbal communication, which I find that interesting, especially you have the interior designers and all like that, and right now a really big concept is the open concept because it makes your house seem open and welcoming and loving, and I find that kind of interesting that it can change based on that. And so it talks about some other nonverbal behavior includes our appearance, our body movement and gestures, our facial expressions, which is talking about social scientists debate whether facial expressions mean the same thing to people everywhere. We know that people are born with facial expressions because babies smile when they're happy or they cry when they're upset. And I think for the most part, from my opinion, I haven't done a ton of research on this, I feel like most facial expressions mean the same thing everywhere. You see videos of individuals from other countries when they communicate, and you can see their facial expressions and kind of tell what the conversation going on is about. The other thing for kind of like body movement and nonverbal communication is eye contact. And for some foreigners, they find it very rude if you just continue to make eye contact, which I think is kind of odd, especially because in America, we talk so much about, in my business class in high school, when we went through the interview process, eye contact was a huge thing. They're like, if you want to look important and you want to know what you're talking about, you have to look at that person. But if I was applying for a job overseas and I kept looking at that person, I probably wouldn't be hired because I am being very rude. And so I think that's kind of interesting. And also I'm wondering how that's going to develop over the next few years, especially as with technology, we have a lot more global companies working together. And I'm wondering, because when I think eye contact, I automatically think of like business and like seriousness and like having a conversation about something important. And the last thing is spacing and touching. And this talks about that Americans are actually pretty okay with touching each other as far as like just an arm on the shoulder. But I also think that depends on how close you are to the person. One thing that we observed today when we were walking around in 10 minutes is one girl who was talking to another girl went to reach out and touch her arm and pulled away like last minute, almost as if to touch and then decide no, but enough that the other girl realized she was in her personal space but not physically touch her, which I thought is kind of interesting because I do see that with a lot of Americans where they like go to put the hand on the back but they don't necessarily do, but the other person is aware of it, so it's not necessarily physically touching, but it's almost like you're touching, that there's awareness there. And the other thing, and the very last thing, is silence, and it says that Americans aren't okay with that, and I'm not okay with silence, primarily if it's someone I don't know. I don't want to just sit there in silence. It makes me feel awkward. I feel like they can hear my stomach growling because I'm always hungry, but silence, I think it depends on who I'm with, because sometimes my roommate and I will sit in the same room for hours and we'll just scroll our phone or we'll just sit there and stare at a TV, and it's not awkward, and that might be because we're doing something, but I even feel awkward just sitting on my phone if it's someone I don't really know, and so that's kind of what I'm comparing it to in regards to having something to do. That was my journal entry 2, and I hope you have a good night.